There we go. I didn't realize I was muted. All right. Hello. Good morning. So if you're here, if you could pop in the chat and say hi, let me see you. Let me know that you're here. I like knowing who's present. I like being able to interact when I can. If you're watching the replay on Facebook, just reply letting me know that you've seen this, that you're taking a look at it, like hashtag replay. So I've been working on some things in the background. Of all things, I'm pulling together a math course. My background, my PhD is in math education. But if you've seen any of my material, as you might imagine, I have a different take on how to approach this stuff. So most of my time, energy, and attention is going into that. And the part of me that is really into zooming in on that kind of wanted to skip this week too. I skipped last week because I just slept in, and there's like an itch to move on, and I might end up changing up this series, the whole thing on mimetic literacy. This is stuff that I want out in the world. I want to encourage, but I think it's also really important for me to keep on the pulse of what's true in each moment. So we'll see if I end up feeling similarly next week. If I keep feeling this kind of glitchiness about it, I might change up how I'm doing these, and I might not do these on such a regular basis. But I'm going to try to weave together some elements of what I'm currently focusing on with this math course. And for those of you who have math anxiety, or I find the topic incredibly boring or whatever, like, trust me, I understand. I really do understand. I'm not going to be going into a lot of depth about the types of things that I think you find boring. My take on the topic, most people find intriguing. My usual shtick is that basically no one has ever been taught math. Sorry, that's a stronger statement than what I mean. I mean that today, basically no one is taught math. Some people learn it despite what they're taught. But most people are taught computation. The actual focus of most math courses is on obedience and on numbing your relationship to your own inner knowing. I know that and this is not because like there's some conspiracy of math teachers. I think math teachers are generally very well-intentioned people who are trying to explain the clearest they can. I say this having had the experience of being a math teacher for about 10 years. This was in university, but I've seen the same thing when I've talked to and watched elementary and middle school math teachers, occasional high school teachers. It's very clear. There's almost unanimously a real concern and care for the students. But the system is not set up for clarity. It's not set up to teach the actual art. So I'm not going to go into a lot of depth here about what the actual art is. I'll do that in a different transmission when I'm really I'm just about ready to launch the stuff on what you could call spiritual math, I guess, but it's not flaky at all. It's more like reclaiming the soul of the art and bringing that forward. So I'll talk about that in more detail as that becomes ready. But there's an element that I think is very apropos for this series, about this game of mimetic literacy. This has to do with the question of how we outsource our knowing, how we outsource our thinking. So as an example, I have to start with something a little inflammatory, right? Something exciting. This morning, when I was waiting for my tea water to boil, actually this could stand to steep a little. So, I overheard the neighbors talking, and I don't know the context of their conversation or their relationship. Uh, 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 William Matheson mentions it, it's outsource thinking. What a beautiful oxymoron. Yeah, yeah, I'll get to that. It's quirky. It's actually necessary. It's actually essential. It's part of the foundation of what allows a culture to exist, particularly a civilization. You have to outsource thinking. You have to. Um, and arguably, you do the same thing inside yourself. I mean, you can't have every neuron taking on the task of every other neuron in the brain. That doesn't work. Instead, the brain does processing in different sections. Um, and Brandon Clearwater mentions it is called the extended mind. Yeah, yeah. So this is not to vilify outsourcing your thinking by any means. It's it is more. It's actually highlighting the question of responsibility. When I say responsibility, I think it's particularly important to note. I wish we had a better word for it, and if I ever discover one, I'll start using it. Responsibility, as we normally use the word, is laced with blame. Like, who is to blame if this goes wrong? You're not accepting responsibility, meaning this screwed up and you are to blame. You should accept the blame. Like, there are lots of variations on that, but if you try to remove blame from responsibility, it's not entirely clear what you're talking about. And so that's a description of the function. But there's another thing that I mean, that responsibility is the closest thing, the closest word I have for describing it. Which, like, it's sort of embedded in the word. What are you able to respond to? What is in your capacity? Like, you could describe the way that an adult is responsible for their child as, well, you should be ashamed of yourself if you let your child be hurt, or you don't feed them sufficiently, or you don't attend to their feelings. And that's about the blame. But there's another thing of something like, well, the kid can't be responsible for their own upbringing. They lack the power. They lack the actual physical and emotional strength needed to do that. But an adult can. So that's the kind of responsibility I mean. I mean, it's something that is completely devoid of any blame, any of the blame. Yeah. So there isn't an inherent problem with outsourcing your thinking, but there is a problem with outsourcing your responsibility for understanding. If you don't even know that you're doing it, then you can end up very lost. And you won't even know you're lost, because lost it'll be the base standard. So back to this example I was highlighting, and William mentions some adults can. yeah. I guess I could be a little more refined about what exactly I mean by adult. So overheard this couple talking, the neighbors talking this morning, and I don't know almost any of the context. I don't know their relationship. I don't know them very well at all. I don't know what prompted this conversation snippet. I'm just standing out there in the sun, and then I overhear, I assume, the wife mentioning something about, it's as though like, women shouldn't be allowed to choose whether they're pregnant or not. Tim mentions being lost, but lost is the baseline. I like that phrase. Cool. So I want to highlight something about this phrasing. Like, I don't think I got the words exactly right, but I don't care that much. This thing of, so women can't be trusted to choose, or shouldn't be allowed to choose, whether they're pregnant or not. Now, I'm not concerned about the content. The content of the it's not exactly a claim. It's more like an objection. There are reasons to push back and forth. I imagine you can imagine what the argument would look like from here. Like, either there would be emphatic agreement, like, yeah, these, like, those these these anti-choice people are so stupid about this. They're oppressing women, blah, blah, blah. So you could imagine a conversation like that. Or you could imagine a conversation where it's a pro-choice and a pro-life person arguing, where it's like, no, women should not be allowed to choose whether or not they can kill someone. Right? You could imagine this going either way. But you notice how there aren't a lot of other conversations that could be? You already know. Like if you have any familiarity with the nature of the abortion debate in the United States, I mean, so what that suggests is, again, emphasizing I don't know the context of what I overheard, but as Bayesians would say, on priors, based on my past experience and based on the way that human minds work, it seems extremely likely to me that what she actually meant is, I feel really upset by this. And then on top of that, I feel really upset by this. She's adding a layer of, and it's not fair. And it's not fair is adding a layer of victim consciousness. Right? That's already outsourcing power. It's outsourcing, like, this is done to me. This is done to other people. That's bad. I'm not to deny the morality of it. I'm not trying to argue about the morality. I'm highlighting the energetics underlying the experience. First, there is, I am hurt. That's just true. Then there's this layer of, and there are villains. They're bad. Okay. And then on top of that is a standard argument. Oh, so women shouldn't be allowed to choose whether or not they're pregnant. And that entire structure is meant to evoke a certain experience. Like if I had phrased it instead as something like, I would have to sit and think about this to do a good job, and I'm not going to be able to do it adequately on the spot like that. But the design of it is trying to highlight something atrocious and it being forced on the woman. That's the narrative spin. And again, I'm not trying to deny that angle, but it is the purpose of that is to push that angle. And the reason for saying any of that is to emphasize and amplify the signal, I'm hurt, I'm scared. But rather than being vulnerable, it's being put as a kind of some combo of assault and a, what's it called? A call to arms. Now, all of that is standard. The pain at the core is very personal. It's very, very personal. And that's not standard at all. It may be replicated, it may be shared, but it's not standard. But the argument is standardized. The fact that it's possible to predict exactly what's going to happen in the conversation. Like I overheard, I assume her husband, responding with something. I couldn't understand the words, and I wasn't really trying to listen very carefully. It's just hard to miss. The part that I heard was hard to miss. But I could imagine in like the vocal tones were such that I wondered if he was saying, well, just sort of like, well, I mean, consider this alternative viewpoint, which is like, which if you imagine, like this is just this is not going to go over well, right? Like either it's agreement, in which case it's emphatic, or it's pushing back, in which case what's going on is basically a denial for pain. Now, the reason I'm highlighting this example, because I brought this in, for one thing, is because it really struck me. It was just stood out this morning. As I'm sitting here going, I feel honestly a little apprehensive about starting the live stream. That's okay. I'll just be with the flow of what's going on in each moment. And then this comes into my awareness. It's like, oh, well, that's striking. I wonder if I'll end up using that example. And I think it fits very well. So the issue, the thing I wanted to highlight here is that she is, rather than expressing the truth, what she had available to her is replicating an argument. And that argument, it's not well designed to change anything, right? It creates a sense of, we agree, if it's with somebody who already agrees with this kind of viewpoint, with that kind of framing. And it creates a standard debate that you can predict if it's with someone who disagrees. Right? So it's not going to change anything. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be said at all, but the purpose of uttering it isn't because it's carefully considered to be something that's going to create change. So the reason I mention this in the context of outsourcing understanding, outsourcing knowing, is that I think this is the natural result of being in a culture that does this, where we're looking to something external to tell us what to think and what to believe. That's ubiquitous. It is so ubiquitous that you should be really suspicious if you think you're not subject to it. I put enormous scrutiny on this. It's the main thing I focus on, honestly. This entire thing about mimetic literacy is me highlighting the importance of watching and being aware of the influence of memes. And I am still totally sucked into this. I'm still finding places where my habitual thinking is saturated with repeated arguments that have been put into me and that I run basically because that's my best understanding of what I'm supposed to do. And I've been doing it for long enough that it's autopilot. And so this is insidious and it's everywhere, absolutely everywhere. So I have some other things on this topic I want to hint at, but there is some conversation being mentioned here. I want to honor it. Let's see. So Brandon mentions, if you outsource your thinking and sense of whether you are lost or not, of course, the outsourced thinkers will give you the thought that you aren't lost, right? And William replies to that saying, sure, just continue to follow them. And that was about 7 minutes ago. Brandon then mentions more recently, if I am feeling pain and don't know how to resolve it, then cause someone else that pain by pushing it upon them. They can figure it out and resolve it for me, easy peasy. Yeah. I suspect, I think you're right that that's the emergent pattern. I suspect that the underlying cause of it is more simple than that. If an infant, if a newborn is really upset and they cry, that's not so that they can push the suffering on others to figure it out. And well, I guess it depends on what you mean by solve it for them. It isn't like they do the solution and then you can import the solution. The infant, in fact, cannot meet their needs. Like, I'm hungry and my only option is to cry. Right? This is particularly obvious at the level of when they can't even roll over. You're just lying there. They're figuring out how to move their bodies at all. And you cry. That's it. That's all you've got. And so there is an actual truth that is embedded in the infantile nature that we all were, that is, help me. I can't do this. I need you to help me, which is true at that age. And as we become more sophisticated, as we grow up, there are things that we want to do that are outside of our power, things that are important to us that are outside of our power. So, so we still rely on others in order to reach the things that we care about. And that's still true for us as adults. I rely on farmers to grow my food. In theory, I guess I could go grow my own food, but that would require getting land, and getting land is a little complicated. And then all my time, not all my time, but a lot of time gets spent growing the food. Like, I could do all that, or I can outsource that power. Right? I mean, we do this all the time. Like, we can't, individual humans can't build skyscrapers. We just can't. But if we want a skyscraper, we've got to rely on something bigger than us to do it. And that basic structure remains the same, basically all the scales. The challenge is when our emotional growth gets stunted, which is actually the standard thing that happens in culture. This is today we talk about this as trauma. If we get stunned at a certain emotional stage, then that stage is childlike, which is it's the standard. It's like the default that happens to almost everybody, getting stunned at some point, several times, often before you're 3 years old, and often many times thereafter. What happens is that emotional way of being becomes a core that you wrap a bunch of strategies around for basically how to get your caregiver's attention and get them to meet your needs. A lot of what I'm pointing at here is the necessity as adults for us to be the adults that respond to our own need for an adult to respond to our pain. It's a little messy, and that quickly goes a lot deeper than I originally intended to ever go in this series, but it's true. That's just very true and simple. So I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying about pushing the pain onto someone else, but I don't think it's quite that conscious. I think it's much more innocent and simple. It's, I need help, 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 and then help comes. Or help doesn't, and you freak out, and your only job is to figure out how to make help come to you. That's the essence of victim consciousness. Victim consciousness is made of operating as a child, and I mean this with no blame and no condescension. It is operating as a child in areas where you would have the power to meet your own needs, but you are instead turning towards a childlike way of being. There's an exception, which is trying to play the role of the parent. But if you're coming in as a parent and infantilizing someone else, inevitably this is going to be because of this mechanism in yourself. Like you're trying to act out the role of parent. Not inevitably, there are exceptions. But the exceptions when you're dealing with another adult are extremely rare. They're very rare, and most people have no idea how to do it. Okay, so in terms of this, I guess I could touch on some. The main thing I want to highlight for this, if there's one piece, there's one essence that I would like to light up in your perception and your mind to get those two things to sync up so that you're able to see it everywhere. This is this quality that I've come to call the aura of authority. Who's the parent? If you're the child, who's the parent? Who is responsible for knowing, for understanding, for guidance? I'll give you a few examples. 1,000 years ago, this was in Europe, this would be the clergy, priesthood especially. It's very explicit. You're not responsible for understanding the Bible. The idea of reading the Bible on your own was a Reformation idea. It was 1500s. Instead, what would happen is you, an illiterate peasant, like even if you could read some writing, you often couldn't read Latin, and all of the church literature was in Latin. So instead, priests and monks, clergy would learn Latin and learn to read it. And although there's some interesting exceptions, this is a funny quirk of history. A lot of the work of monks was creating and illustrating copies of the Bible. So this is prior to the printing press, so they'd have to do all this by hand. And some monks were illiterate. And so you get this really quirky phenomenon of some monks would actually be looking at the shapes and they wouldn't know what the letters were. They wouldn't know that they were letters. Maybe they knew, oh, these are called letters, but they wouldn't be able to read it. They were just looking at the shapes and copying the shapes. They wouldn't know which parts were important or not, so they just copy the whole thing. So a fascinating quirk of of Western history there. But for the most part, certainly priests had to know how to read and speak and understand Latin. The Mass would be held in Latin. In nomine Patri et Filius et Spiritus Sanctus. Amen. It's Latin. The important part is not that you, a peasant who's showing up, or a congregation member who is showing up for Mass, it's not important that you understand. What's important is that all of this is being done to you and for you by an authority. And you're outsourcing the responsibility of your relationship to the divine to authority, which is just how Europe was for about 1,000 years. If you imagine, this is the basis of the culture that took over the world. You think that that attitude might have had some effect on how we orient to where knowing happens and where our relationship to spirituality is? A lot of the Reformation in the 1500s included this element of personal relationship to God. You need to read the Bible. The Bible is translated into the local languages, and the Gutenberg press spread the Bible around, so people were able to do that. But you're still outsourcing your relationship to the divine. It's a little closer. You're outsourcing it to a book. It isn't that you read the book and the book gives you this divine revelation, and now you don't need the book anymore. No. You keep studying the Bible your whole life. And there's some groups that understand this is more like a syncing up process, and it's not that the Bible is sacred, it's that the Bible is guiding you. But that's kind of rare. You start to see more and more of this internalized stuff going all the way into saying, no, internal authority. This is becoming a little more common in some of the modern spiritual movements, but only a little bit. Only a little bit. People talk about the law of attraction. Even if the law of attraction were literally true, exactly as they think, why do they believe it? Where does the knowing come from? Oh, it resonates. Okay. A common quirk of a common place where people miss the way that memes actually work on us as a culture, as a people, as a human race, is that resonance does not mean it is true. Resonance means it's familiar, that it is consistent. Truth does have something you can call a resonance, but most people have not cultivated the awareness of that sense because they're outsourcing their knowing. So, clergy is one example. Around the ballpark of the 1950s, it was earlier than that, but certainly 1950s United States, science got this aura. We still have that today, but it's a reason why during the pandemic the emphasis was believe the science. You could read into it with this quality of it's like sinning to doubt the science. You must have faith. The thing is that the way that science actually works, so I would say actually, I mean something in particular. What I'm talking about is the foundation of the scientific revolution, the essence of what science really is. You don't have to put any effort into believing it. Right? If I said something like, believe that you are looking at a screen, or if you're just listening to this, that you're listening to my voice, believe that you're listening to my voice. Like, that's nuts. Like, what's that statement even for? it's not doing anything. It's not actually saying anything. Because like, what? As opposed to doing what? Disbelieving it? No, if you actually understand why something is true, you don't have to believe it. You see it, you know it, you're done. the reason belief is relevant in that kind of context is because of outsourcing the responsibility of seeing, knowing, and understanding to an institution. Now, like scientific institutions in the scientific establishment, like it's sort of necessary, because I'm not going to go around doing literally every experiment throughout the course of history and thinking through everything all the way carefully. I really like science, and I've done a lot of reading on this stuff, and I've looked at enough that I can go, okay, I can see how these patterns work. My background is more mathematics than science, but so I don't have as much experience in a laboratory. But the thing is that the basic principles still apply. My PhD is actually in math and science education. I worked side by side by people who are emphasizing more about physics and biology. And so the basic principle is the same. I'm emphasizing it in a math flavored way, but it's the same thing. When you see the truth, you shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So the whole thing about believe the science, part of what that's emphasizing is have trust in what institutions are doing. When they say they've looked and they have concluded something, oh look, we've carefully examined this. Like I don't have direct scientific knowing of the existence of DNA. I just don't. I trust that the information I've been given about the nature of how biology works, and that it comes down to this DNA code, that there's at least some truth in there. There seems to be a lot of truth in there. But I haven't looked, right? So in that sense, I'm believing the scientific establishment, and that's important. But if I don't notice that I am believing, I'm putting trust in a social structure to do the knowing for me. If I don't notice that, then I am outsourcing my responsibility of understanding. I could stand to have a better phrase here. I notice I'm equivocating, and I want to be precise about this. I am outsourcing my knowing. I'm outsourcing my responsibility about, for instance, DNA. Guaranteed. What I try to be careful of is to not outsource my grokking, to outsource my gnosis. So as a it might actually be helpful for me to give a quick example of gnosis. It's something that you can actually know for yourself. All the best examples are mathematical. I mean, math is the study of this. Math is the study of gnosis. It's the study of deep understanding on your own terms. This is the main thing that I notice. This is not really taught. It sometimes is learned anyway, but it's sort of haphazard and confused with outsourcing your thinking to symbolic manipulation. Okay, so the example that's jumping to mind, I'll just run with this. So there's a property that I imagine you're familiar with. Formally, it's called commutativity of multiplication. If you think commuting is like you're moving, and so commutativity is describing that A times B is the same as B times A. They can commute, they can move around, and it doesn't change the result. But this actually says something deep. This is not a description of how you write it. I mean, it kind of is, but the writing is capturing something important. A times B is not the same thing as B times A. They just give you the same result. If I say that I have 12 bags of apples and every bag has 5 apples in it, then that's 12 times 5 apples, which is to say I have 60 apples total. Okay, that's multiplication in one direction. The thing that commutativity is saying is that I'll still have 60 apples if I switch it around such that I only have 5 bags, but each bag has 12 apples. Now you can check that, like you can actually physically check that, but there's something a little surprising. The claim is that this is true regardless of how huge the numbers are, even when the numbers are fractions, even when some of the numbers are negative. Do you notice how there's actually a question here? Right? It's saying that you can write the multiplication in either direction is actually saying something quite deep. Now, most of us are used to basically trusting that that works. So when you're memorizing your times tables, you probably didn't double your memorization effort. I know that when I was a kid, I couldn't do 8 times 7, but I could do 7 times 8, and I have this verbal strain. 7 times 8 is 56. So if I saw 8 times 7, like that doesn't sound right. But if I swap them around, 7 times 8 is 56, and 7 times 8 is the same as 8 times 7. So 8 times 7 is 56. So you can cut the number that of multiplications that you have to memorize in half using that trick in rough half. But in order to do that, you have to already know that multiplication commutes. So if that knowledge is based on, well, the teacher said so and I trust the teacher, then you haven't understood why it works. There's actually something quite deep. There's a process of looking at that and examining it. I think it's heavier and even more mathy than I want to get into to explain exactly why. Exactly why multiplication commutes, but if at the very least, notice the question. Notice there's something strange, right? That's a gap in gnosis. That's a gap in understanding. Right? So what I'm highlighting is, if I think what I actually mean is that if I am outsourcing the responsibility of tracking where I do and do not have gnosis, then I end up lost, because I am trusting something external to me to tell me what I do and do not know. And if something external can argue with me, can provide a convincing argument, and I can't beat the argument, then even if some part of me knows that their conclusion is wrong, I may feel like I have to go along with the conclusion. So places where this shows up just in more casual situations. The way that, like if I'm invited to a party, if my friend Brian is throwing some kind of party and I just don't feel like going, and this is not real, by the way, but I'm just imagining, trying to make it concrete and going, yeah, Brian's throwing some parties, some gatherings. I'm like, okay, cool. So I imagine this. Brian invites me to something and I just don't want to go. So my gut response, I don't feel like it. Okay. But if I say, thank you for the invite, but I don't think I want to go to this. If he asks, well, why not? I go, well, why don't I? Well, it feels kind of like, kind of tired, and I sort of want to read my book instead. And if he responds as something like, well, but I'm only gonna like this is let's say bringing over some friends from out of town, and they're only going to be in town this once, and so you'll miss the opportunity. Like, oh man, I mean, that is a good point. Brandon mentions, I hope that one day you'll be able to turn down real parties and not just imaginary ones. No, and the reason this comes to mind is because Brian did invite me to a party recently and I went to it. And so that was just the concrete thing that came to mind. But if he's able to go, okay, so I have these friends from out of town, they're only gonna be in town like these couple of days, and I really want you to meet them. It's like, okay, I guess that makes sense. Excuse me. Hold on. Every now and then I have to check whether I can breathe water. So the fact that, like, even if my knowing in my body is, no, I don't want to go. That's just true. I don't want to go. Oh, these friends are from out of town. Okay, does that change my want to go? No, it doesn't. But it does change something like my ideas of whether I should go or not. And if my thinking concludes based on the information I'm getting that I should want to go, according to what? According to some external standard, then my not wanting to go is maybe something like a moral failing or something I should just ignore. And if I don't go, I should feel bad about it, right? Because I'm doing something wrong, which is actually more like it's an internalized version of the fear of disappointing your parents or angering your parents, depending on, like, you have to edit in the actual relationship you had with your caregivers. So this is a case where, this is an example type where the outsourcing move, outsourcing the responsibility for tracking your knowing, can result in you being confused about what you even want. Because you know what you should want. Never mind what you actually want is the source of power of movement for your body. So you can't actually keep up with mental expectations that are your internalized copies of the externalized rules about what you do and do not know, what you should and should not do. So that's the thing that I'm inviting you to track, these places where are you not tracking what you do and do not know because you're relying on something outside of you to tell you what you do and do not know, which can also show up as what you do and do not want. Right? So science as an institution has a kind of, it has a condescending parental tone to it. Oh, this science is very advanced, and these scientists over here have figured out these things because they're so clever, or they've put in a lot of effort. And the conclusion, like, which you can trust, because look at all this peer review and peer review process. It's worth bearing in mind, most people don't know what peer review is. And those who even know what peer review is, hardly any of them have ever been involved in peer review. I promise, if you were actually involved in peer review process, you might have a lot more skepticism about whether peer review actually matters that much. In theory, it does, but in practice, as a social institution and practice as it actually is, it's kind of crappy. It has a lot of politics interwoven into it. This is less true the more hard the science is. Like, this is less of an issue. It's basically a non-issue in math. It's barely an issue in physics, although there's still social standing stuff of you dare not turn down the paper of somebody who's really high up. It's psychology and sociology are just screwed on this. The replication crisis highlights some of the consequence of not just peer review being glitchy, but a lot of things along these lines. The replication crisis is an echo. Brandon says it's when you quickly peer over your paper before publishing it. But the relevant thing here is to highlight the way in which a lot of people don't even know what peer review is, but somehow a paper being peer reviewed makes it more trustable. Okay, so if you don't have a deep understanding of the actual social system that peer review is, and your inclination is to trust a paper because it was peer reviewed, then this is outsourcing your knowing in a deep way. This is outsourcing your gnosis. this is where authority becomes overpowered in its ability to possess you. So the whole bit about believe the science, the reason for this is because we've taken the tone of our orientation to the priesthood, and we have put this onto science. Okay. Tim mentions also significant p-values. Yeah, and there's a whole thing in the replication crisis around p-values, and we know about things like p-hacking, but there's pure math is reliable in its own terms, but the how to apply math to the real world, as though math and the real world are separate, but ignore that for a moment. When you're actually applying mathematics to the real world, it is a quirky implication of Gödel's incompleteness theorems, along with a couple of related pieces. But one of the implications of Gödel's incompleteness theorems, particularly the first one, is that you cannot have a completely formal system that captures all of the ways of map that correctly captures how to map your formal system onto lived experience. It can't capture everything. Okay. Now, I'm being a little fast and loose. That's not actually what Gödel's incompleteness theorem says, but it is an implication. It's an implication. A more honest way of expressing it is that experience is infinitely rich and math is very thin. That's how it's able to be precise and sort of epistemically perfect. So the process of how do you connect the numbers to the world, that's always going to be complicated and made of nuance. So what we find with significant p-values, there's a systemic lack of humility about what we actually know, even when the p-values are enormously small, when they're super tiny. Okay? When you're incredibly certain that you have that this is unlikely to happen in comparison to the null hypothesis. I used to teach this kind of statistics, and it's a little ridiculous. It's a good art. I'm glad that we have it, but the confidence is not in the experiment. People miss where the confidence actually is because they are outsourcing their gnosis. So this business of so this aura of authority. Oh, hold on before I continue. William mentions, would it be accurate to say numerology is to mathematics what astrology is to astronomy? I don't really know what you're asking there. I mean, intuitively, my gut wants to say, yeah, those feel similar. But what I think that is actually going on is that numerology and astrology are both what mathematics and astronomy are part of a coherent paradigm that that is in vogue. It has been in vogue for about 300 years. And that paradigm calls the cluster of practices like numerology and astrology woo. And William mentions, I mean, there are a lot of charlatans out there, don't get me wrong. Yeah, there are also a lot of what should be correctly considered charlatans in more formal domains. Not so much in mathematics. It's really hard to be a charlatan in mathematics. And in pure math, it's really tricky, but not so hard with statistics, being a statistician. Okay. There are like the whole debunking effort with I have a whole big rant there about the way that the scientific system will not the scientific system, I should say the skeptic communities and atheist groups that are really attacking religion and the debunkers, thinking like Penn and Teller and the amazing James Randi. They're taking an often useful tool and they're applying it as a weapon to attack an entire mimetic family without any curiosity about why that mimetic family exists. They assume they already know. Oh, it's because people are biased. It's because people are confused by blah, blah, blah. The thing that things like numerology and astrology are, and I'm just mentioning as if it's not measured, it must be bullshit. Yeah, it's like battle cry of the left hemisphere. Yeah, so numerology and astrology are trying to bring in some of the tools that are used in more rigorous domains and work with them in order to reintroduce meaning and spirituality. And because those are explicitly banished in the formal domains, they are considered woo. Which is not to say that there aren't people who are really, really terrible about their reasoning, who are butchering. Like almost any time anybody outside of physics or computer science utters the word quantum, there's a part of me that wants to tear my eyebrows out. It's just, they don't know what they're talking about. They just absolutely do not. No, quantum mechanics does not show that consciousness creates your reality. If it did show that, every meaning-making system would be deeply fucked. It would be awful. It would be horrendous. It's not what folk want. But most people who are talking about things like tapping into the quantum field or doing quantum affirmations, most of the time what they're actually trying to do is legitimize their spiritual practice by reference to authority. They recognize that science has the aura of authority and they are trying to legitimize their own spiritual practices and their own attempts to seek insight. And the way in which they know to do that is to reference a priesthood that legitimizes it. And since there is a kind of narrative hand-waving thing, particularly around quantum mechanics, that makes it sound roughly right, and there are a bunch of people who have done a lot of investigation and thinking, including some physicists, who say, oh yeah, this is finding the same kind of thing as talked about in the Upanishads and Buddha and all of this stuff. And it's like deep and Taoism, I guess, like the Tao of physics is a used to be a well-known book in this area. But it's still outsourcing knowing. And in my opinion, the core of spirituality is about recognizing that the knowing comes from within. What you know gets refined over time. You come to understand the nature of your insight more deeply through examination. This is the art of learning. But your knowing, where you stand, is internal. So a lot of these spiritual communities who are outsourcing their knowing to quantum mechanics and saying, oh, well, quantum physicists say blah, 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 and that legitimizes our belief in, because they talk about the 0 point field. It's this infinite field of energy. And it's like this field of energy that you can feel everywhere. Like, okay, I mean, I agree, you're connecting words together, but you're not actually connecting understanding. And by doing so, you're actually alienating yourself from the deep spiritual art of Gnosis, of actual knowledge. So that's where I take issue with people who go into astrology and numerology. It's not specific to quantum mechanics, but that's where I have an issue with what they're doing. But as to being analogous, numerology is to mathematics, what astrology is to astronomy, in the sense of what domain they're borrowing their attempts to tap into something deep from. William adds, what if every meaning-making system is deeply flawed, H/J? I don't know what H/J means. So the that is actually that is a more accurate way of describing the main conclusion of, I mean, what? Oh, half joking. Got it. Thank you. HJ is half joking. Yeah. So every meaning-making system is deeply flawed. One way to articulate the Gödel's first incompleteness theorem is that every system that you're dealing with is, I mean, and some people are going to jump on me saying this isn't precise enough. That's fine. We can make it more precise, but what I'm saying is still correct. It is either too simple to describe all the things you care about. It is inconsistent, and its illogic is how it's actually able to describe everything. Or there's something within the realm of things that are relevant to you that it cannot describe. That's Gödel's first incompleteness theorem. Intuitively, it's an intuitive way of gesturing at the connection there. Okay, so yes, actually, every meaning-making system is deeply flawed. So there's a question when you try to orient to this. Okay, so if every meaning-making system, if you live entirely within a meaning-making system, you're guaranteed to be trapped in something that will eventually prove itself to be untrue in some fashion. So if you are going to align with truth at a very deep level, how do you do it? It's a good koan. So Brandon mentioning, I conjured up a cat once by putting uranium in an empty box. Works half the time. Cute. Cute. Okay. So the thing that I'm pointing out with the aura of authority is actually not just about science. I want to tie this up because I'm getting into an hour here, and I feel like I've made the main point, but I want to just highlight the expanse of this. We do the same thing with things like the FDA. Obviously, we used to. The FDA lost a lot of credibility in the CDC over the pandemic. But the whole business of, like CDC guidelines suggest blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, the reason that it's worth following those guidelines is to the extent that you trust that they're doing a good sense-making process. And part of the difficulty that a lot of these institutions put forward is that they started to make it clear that a lot of their choices for what suggestions to give throughout the pandemic were based on how to manage public opinion, particularly about wanting to avoid creating vaccine hesitancy and therefore hiding information about the vaccines that could be misleading. Can you catch the patronizing tone there? Oh, you're not up to actually understanding this. Let us make sure that you know what to think and feel about this topic. That's independent of whether they're right or wrong. The patronizing tone is highlighting something very important about not only the way in which the population, right now I'm focusing on the United States, the population had been outsourcing their understanding of what's safe for food. What should we do in the case of dangerous diseases? We're outsourcing that understanding to institutions a little blindly, maybe a lot blindly. And those institutions take it on in a condescending parental role. You're condescending, I'm adding judgment. I could also say they're doing infantilization, which also has a judgment tone to it. I do think that this is extremely glitchy and dangerous. This is, it's really bad. But the problem is, excuse me, the problem is not that these institutions are corrupt. The problem is if you just imagine two people interacting where they're each outsourcing their responsibility for knowing what's going on to the other, neither of them are understanding what's going on. So the protocol that they're using to interact determines, sort of like a computer would, what they come to believe. I know I just ran through that very fast, and this is actually quite a deep point. If you understand this point, a lot of conspiracies start to look really stupid. Not just, oh, that's bad taste. Oh, that sounds weird. No, it's not just that. I mean, a lot of times, if you actually understand this mechanism, you can see you don't need a conspiracy to produce the thing that people are explaining with conspiracy thinking. You can see it because that's how it works when you have systems of people who are all abandoning their own responsibility to understand. Then nobody understands, and the emergent cultural system optimizes for something else. Where we are going as a species is, as far as I can tell, we have basically two kinds of possible trajectories. Either we will get sent back to our room, so to speak, go through slow, maybe rapid, but probably slow civilizational decay and isolation as we sort of think about what we've done and find out what happens over the next couple hundred years. Or we rebuild our civilization with a deep recognition that each individual needs to accept responsibility for their own understanding. And of course, you can't know and understand literally everything, but when you're outsourcing your understanding to something else to track, that is a social move. And that's different from the knowing that I can feel my tongue in my mouth. It's different from the way in which I know the Pythagorean Theorem. But most people know the Pythagorean Theorem as something that they were supposed to memorize. The square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the square of the other two sides, or a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Think, okay, great. Why? What if for certain kind of aberrant triangles, some sort of special triangles, it turns out that it isn't quite right? Why doesn't it apply to equilateral triangles? Or obtuse triangles? Why does it have to be right triangles? What about right triangles is this about? Right? That's a place where people usually outsource their knowing. And so just learning to track where we're turning to an authority, when the aura of authority is taking on something for us, and when we're going, tell me, daddy, what to do, as an emotional, energetic thing. I actually don't like that mocking tone. I sort of borrowed that from Perry Chase, but I don't care for it. In the places where we accept our roles as children, in some ways we may have to be children. Certainly we had to be when we were kids, and our power is finite, so we have limitations. So being realistic about that seems important. But at least noticing, oh, right here, I am trusting them to take care of this domain for me. Because if the United States were made of people who were doing this, and the CDC or an FDA did anything along the lines of, oh, well, we put out this information, we were holding back this information because we were concerned about creating vaccine hesitancy, the answer would be, that's our call, not yours. You have just lost most of your legitimacy. Show your work or stop existing, because we're not going to listen to you anymore if you're going to deceive us. Then we wouldn't be in nearly as much of a mess about pro-vaccine versus anti-vaxxer. That just wouldn't be a thing. I mean, of course, it's going to be a thing some places, because everybody's, for every version of possible insanity, there's somebody like that in practice. But the situation would be a lot simpler. As far as I can tell, the way in which we get to a civilization like that. So not by trying to make everybody else do that, but by each one of us deciding independently, pseudo-independently, like deciding for ourselves, I want to understand. And I accept responsibility for understanding and for tracking where I don't, and I am trusting instead. Okay. So let's see. William mentions a key part of the word responsibility is response. There's a certain dynamism there. Yeah. A lot of people do this wordplay of responsibility is ability to respond, and it's response as opposed to react. The thing is that if you can tell the difference between response and reaction, you already know the thing. Oh, you even say response as distinct from react. Yep. That's like the meme. And yeah, let's be quote unquote ableist. This is indeed an ability to cultivate throughout our lives. Yeah, I don't know if you know this, but the word ableist, Sybil might mean something else. I don't know. Yeah, ableist is a social justice term that it's ableism is to physical disabilities, I think mental disabilities as well, as racism is to I guess the analog would be racial minorities. But yeah, very much, I understand the tone that I believe you're saying here, this element of these are skills. The capacity of accepting responsibility, it's not you do it or you don't, and you should do it. And if you don't, you're a bad person. No. This is part of maturing. This is mental maturity, also emotional maturity, but it's mental maturity. And it's part of cultivating adults in our culture. And we don't have very many. I strive to be an adult. I hope I become one day. I'm actually pretty good at it at this point, but I would like to be much better at it. We need a civilization of adults, of people who are not infantile. And I'm still working out some of my own infantilism, some of my own victim consciousness. And I probably will be for the rest of my life. Brandon mentions, if we are aware of what, if we are aware of what we are childlike in and adult in, we can be consciously involved in that, improving or developing, rather than potentially being stagnant or being confused on what we are an adult in and what we are a child in. Yeah, I just agree. And William replies to that saying, we see adulthood as a binary thing, and it elides a lot of nuance. Yeah. I have a whole rant about how he's just a child. Right? There's no fine line between child and adult. This idea that somebody who's 17 cannot make choices about their lives, but somebody who's 18 suddenly is capable of it, as though, particularly if you go the day before their birthday to the next day, there's like, really? Is it really that big of a difference? And Tim popped in at the same moment saying, you mean people don't stay the same forever after they reach 18? Yeah, well, that's not the same thing, but there's, I guess we're highlighting different elements of this magical line. Yeah. The whole way in which children are oriented to is something like subhuman, almost like they're precious possessions that need to be controlled and guided, and we get to have them grow. Like my child, it's like, if when you stop doing that and you look at children, you recognize that there is actually something much more profoundly sacred and beautiful about the honor of being the steward of a new soul entering the physical world. You don't have to add a whole bunch of things. Oh, spiritual world, something souls, blah, blah, blah. I'm trying to gesture towards something that I think even materialists would agree with if I were to translate it to their frame. So we are all feeling our way into the physical world and learning how to be here. And that goes on forever, as far as I can tell. Brandon mentions, we need to come up with more labels to honor the full spectrum of adultness. Yeah, I agree. And William replies to that saying, I think the category silos are the problem. Yeah, William, I think you and I were just saying the same thing. Yeah. Okay. I guess I wanted to tie one last little bow piece in here because I started with this example of the neighbors and the thing about mechanical arguments. This could stand to have its own ongoing discussion, but I just want to highlight that if you're in the habit of, and it's not binary, I'm going to use binary language because it's clearer here, but as we just described, this is not really you either do or you don't. Right? To the extent that you outsource your thinking, your beliefs, and your trust to other systems, those other systems can tell you how you now should react and how you should speak and think about topics. So the whole thing about Roe versus Wade getting overturned and then lots of people being upset by it, the truth is the pain. That's something you can stay with and be clear on. That's where the Gnosis begins. But the inclination to lean into already stated arguments and repeat them, that's an autopilot that has to do with what amounts to following instructions. You are running a program that was installed in you to the extent that you do that. That doesn't mean you are a bad person if you do. That's just another program. I'm describing something that is true. It's just true. If you are running these already stated arguments, particularly if you're emphatically trying to join these causes, what that means is that you are lending your physical energy and your capacity of choice. You're lending all of that power to these systems. Where did you decide to trust them? Why? I'm not claiming you shouldn't. I'm inviting awareness. It's the same thing. It's the same thing over and over again. Where are you outsourcing your knowing? Just notice. Nothing wrong with doing so, but it is painful and it can be destructive to the things that you care about. And the more that you notice, the clearer that will be on your own terms. Okay, so I'm going to close here. Thank you for joining me. Yeah. And I'm going to start putting out some things quite soon about this math course that I'm putting together. So it is about practicing, mastering, developing this kind of gnosis, this deeper knowing. So I'll be talking about that pretty soon. And yeah, and if I make any modifications to this weekly live stream, I'll announce that. See Brandon mentioning words are perhaps are always silos, and it is useful to know there probably always are exceptions from the literal interpretation. Like adult and child means something, but of course there are nuances. Yeah, there's a nice article on the blog lesswrong.com called The Cluster Structure of Thing Space. It talks about this, about how there's something useful about words, even if the words can't be perfectly precise in describing everything. So I think it's a similar theme there. And Brandon adds, I was actually joking about making just more words for adultness. It can quickly just be more confusing by having so many words, especially new ones. I agree. I am not advocating just for language shift. And it's good to see you here, Talia. Okay. You keep sneaking in something at the last moment here. William says, I trusted the systems because I believed in a world where people did not deceive. Yeah. Yeah. And so then there's this question of, where did that belief come from? Why did you believe that? When you really examine these things, and you start really grounding in the deep inner place of knowing, it gets a lot of fun to start to dissect beliefs, and it can be quite confronting, but really beautiful. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you so much for coming. I will see many of you next week.